Dear colleagues and friends, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the conference, The Holocaust and the Cold War, Culture and Justice. It is an extraordinary conference under extraordinary circumstances. The latter need barely be explained. Most of our conference speakers have recorded their presentations because we want to have as much time as possible for the discussions, particularly in a video format. The conference itself is the result of an extraordinary cooperation between the Imre Kertész Kolleg in Jena and the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt. As you might imagine, we originally planned for two distinct but thematically related conferences to be held in June and July last year. Then, under the pressure of circumstances, we planned for one big joint conference in January this year. And we had to postpone it once again to May, still hoping to meet in person. And now, well, here we are, all in the video webinar. So much as to current circumstances. We're not the first to hold a major online conference, and I'm confident that the format will work. I'm much looking forward to discuss a highly intriguing and highly topical issue with you. The memory of the Holocaust is highly contested. We heard numerous statements in Germany last week on the moral commitment to stand up against any form of anti-Semitism. For a large majority, this commitment is central to Germany's democratic identity, and it is an unsettling experience to see it contested. We have also heard protesters during the last month who made provoking connections between the Holocaust and COVID-19 restrictions. And again, public rejections were quick and unequivocal. The sheer necessity to insist on the seemingly obvious should concern us. There's a strange discrepancy in German discussions between the wish to commemorate lesser-known victims of National Socialism on the one hand, and the increasing need to defend a specific commitment which flows from the insight into the dimensions of the Holocaust on the other. In Poland, we have a somewhat different situation. Historians Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski have been sued in court for tarnishing the memory and the reputation of a wartime village elder whom they had found to be an accomplice, współwinny, to murdering Jews whom he had turned over to the German authorities. This trial is a keystone to Polish politics of history, which is set on putting the Polish nation firmly and without reservations on the side of the victims and rejecting even the smallest hint at any form of complicity. These debates are not new, neither in Poland nor in Germany. The intention of this conference is to explore to what extent they might be traced back to the times of the Cold War, and how the Cold War shaped the way in which European societies have engaged with the Holocaust during the first post-war decades. Several observations hint in this direction. Let me briefly explain. In the standard account of Holocaust memory and the history of Holocaust memory, the onset of the Cold War blocked any recognition of the Holocaust as the core of National Socialist politics, Nazi politics of annihilation, and as a uniquely Jewish experience. Anti-fascism in the East and theories of totalitarianism in the West neatly dovetailed, with opposing views on West Germany, of course, as their focal point. Only since the 1960s, the focus shifted from heroism and resistance to suffering and victimhood. Beginning in the US, a new reading emerged which informs today's understanding of the Holocaust. Recent research has complicated this picture. It has greatly advanced our knowledge on early attempts by survivors to grasp what had happened and to collect the evidence. As we learned from some of the presentations to this conference, survivor testimony and survivor experience was far from being silenced with the start of the Cold War, but remained relevant through the 1950s and early 60s in conflict with hegemonial memory, as outlined just a few minutes ago. Recent research also unfolds how legal procedures since the late 1950s recovered survivor testimony and how they established firm knowledge of the functioning of concentration camps and the backgrounds of industrial annihilation of human lives. The institutional foundations of criminal investigations thus came into focus. Survivors and prosecutors in this respect were experts in their own right and we still need to explore how they formed specific epistemic communities. Norbert Frey was one of the first scholars also to hint at their cooperations across the Iron Curtain. Such cooperations are a burgeoning field of research, and several presenters will address their scope, but also their limitations. Research and memory do not dovetail neatly. I doubt that they ever do. But it seems fair to say that in the Western world, since the 1960s, research on the Holocaust and Holocaust memory overlapped and informed each other. Eastern Europe followed suit after 1989. Archives opened, and sensitive topics could now be addressed more openly in the former Eastern Bloc as well. Yet while research seems to have long left behind Cold War restrictions, memory has not. The current debates in Germany and in Poland, which I mentioned before, can be seen as the outcome of two major developments. On the one hand, current politics of identity and victimhood in Poland are set on rejecting the notion that the Holocaust could form the core of a European memory. East Europeans, not just Poles, argue that the claim to the unique character of the Holocaust played down their suffering from Soviet occupation. The European Parliament has picked up on this without being able to resolve the conflict. The Cold War constellation in this way seems to return in a new disguise. Recent events in the Middle East, on the other hand, hint at a post-colonial critique of Holocaust memory. Just remember last year's debate in Germany on philosopher Achim Mbembe, who had compared Israeli politics with apartheid. Or take Michael Rothberg's argument that Holocaust memory from its inception during the 1960s allegedly was meant to crowd out the memory of slavery in an age of decolonialization. This post-colonial critique has less to do with the Cold War. Yet it does correspond with changing interpretations of the Cold War that are now equally giving more attention to the Global South. This leads me to the question whether the Cold War is a suitable heuristic concept for our purposes in the first place. In terms of a global ideological and systemic confrontation, its value seems obvious. But the answer will be more ambiguous if we look not just at the late 1940s and the 50s and early 60s, but also keep the significance of the Eichmann trial and the 6 Days War in mind, which will be addressed also by several presenters. We might get back to this question of caesuras within the Cold War at the end, in our concluding panel. So this is the background against which we will explore various fields of culture and justice in addressing the Holocaust. Let me briefly introduce you to the first panels. The first panel on societies will address the development of Holocaust commemoration in select European countries. Case studies on the Netherlands, on France and Slovakia show that developments in the first two post-war decades were quite complex, shaped by conflicting memories and internal political cleavages. As Simon Perrigo argues for France, the Cold War was not an obstacle to commemoration, but its framework. The second panel will be devoted to various aspects of research. Here, the mentioned transnational connections will come to the fore. The third panel then addresses the ideological impact of the Cold War, both on the production and the reception of Holocaust literature. We will hear about works by Andrzej Szczypiorski, Imre Kertész, and Arnold Lustig, among others, brought together not least by the ongoing debate on the authenticity of literary testimony. And then the fourth panel will take a look at films, a particularly transnational field of Holocaust representation, as I also learned from some of the presentations. Our speakers also explore the relationship between documentary footage and how it was used in an aesthetic way, and they will thus return once more to questions of authenticity in art. The panel equally looks at specifically aesthetic means to expand ideological restrictions and to introduce elements of modernism in representing a difficult past. Rita Horvath's presentation to this fourth panel will also serve as an introduction to the film screening of Cold Days, Hidek Nopok, for tomorrow evening. Please keep in mind that you have to register separately for this film so as to be provided with the link. From tomorrow afternoon onwards, we will then address the judicial aspects of our topic. And before I give the floor to Sybille Steinbacher, who will introduce you to this part of the conference, I would like to take the opportunity to thank her and her staff at Fritz Bauer Institute, particularly Hannah Hecker and Katharina Rauschenbacher, but also to Raphael Utz, Daniela Gruber, and Diana Josef here in Jena for the great organizational support in setting up this conference. We might spend less time and money on catering, on travel, and accommodation if we do conferences like this online. But the organizational work behind the scenes is still enormous. And of course, we miss personal meetings. A brief look at the conference website should suffice to demonstrate what I'm trying to say. But at least it provides us with the opportunity to familiarize us with our respective research and to freely discuss it. So thank you all again for setting the stage for a promising venue. Welcome again, and thank you for your attention. And now Sybille Steinbacher, please.
Yes, dear colleagues and friends, I'd also like to warmly welcome you to our joint conference on the Holocaust and the Cold War, Culture and Justice. I'm delighted that what was initially planned at 2 conferences could be shaped into one that was shared and in addition could be realized online under the present circumstances. Our program is unmistakably very full. 9 panels with a total of 28 lectures, a film evening, and a closing discussion. So if you consider this might be a bit much, you're totally right. But we are trying the experiments since we think the questions concerning us here are really important, and we are very interested in exploring them together over the next 2 days. Joachim von Puttkamer has just laid out the conference's broad framework, and he sketched out what will be addressed in the realm of culture. I'd like to offer a few remarks on the realm of justice. The reflections in that respect are grounded in the research on the trials held to prosecute Nazi crimes in West Germany, especially in the state of Hesse, where Fritz Bauer spurred legal proceedings forward, playing a central role in organizing the major Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt am Main, among other proceedings. In the 1950s and 60s, the West German judicial system responded with such trials to ongoing debates about the mass crimes in the Nazi period. But at the same time, these trials themselves had a public impact. One of our starting premises is that such processes may well have been at work also in East Bloc countries. In the end, every Eastern European state had experienced the German occupation in its own specific way. Not rarely the crimes unfolded in full public view. We can thus reasonably presume a large degree of intrinsic public interest in prosecution for these crimes, interest then reflected in trials with subsequent societal effects. A connected premise is that the East German state played a special role in this legal societal constellation, since the state had to investigate its own citizens. This is the backdrop to our conference's interest in examining the trials in the context of system competition between East and West, but also as the expression of distinct prosecutorial premises and intentions in each East Bloc country. When it comes to the immediate post-war phase of these trials, some knowledge is already available. For instance, through historical commissions set up at East European crime scenes to collect the remainders of Jewish scholarship, but also to secure evidence of the crimes with a view to future trials. In Poland, for example, there was already prosecution of large criminal groupings, as for example, the trial in 1946 of Amon Goeth for crimes committed as commandant of the Krakow-Blaszow concentration camp, or the trial in 1947 of 40 former Auschwitz guards in Krakow, and also the trial of Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Höss that same year before the Polish High Court in Warsaw. In Czechoslovakia as well, by 1948, special courts and the national court had sentenced more than 33,000 persons as war criminals or collaborators. Half of these individuals were of German nationality. Similarly, in Hungary, between 1944 and 46, more than 20,000 Nazi criminals and collaborators faced special courts and tribunals, including many members of the Nazi collaborating previous Hungarian government. In the Soviet Union, the trials already began in July 1943 in Krasnodar, in proceedings against Soviet helpers of German Sonderkommando number 10A. We can only estimate the number of trials of collaborators, German war prisoners, and other alleged Nazi criminals that had been held by Soviet courts until 1950. Until 1947, in the Soviet occupation zone of defeated Germany, trials were organized by the Soviet military administration, and later on, East German courts took over the proceedings. In the first years here, many trials were marked by draconian punishment of the perpetrators. But following the Waldheim trials of thousands of accused Nazis in 1950, only scattered criminal proceedings would be organized in East Germany. All told, everywhere in Eastern Europe, the early trials were stamped by the fresh experience of intense violence. But they were also characterized by the hard Stalinist and anti-Semitic course taken by the Soviet Union and its allies into the mid-1950s, and that was aimed at putative domestic opponents. The trials organized in various Eastern countries in the 1960s marked a second wave of criminal prosecution. Until now, these trials have been treated only from a vantage point of competition between communist and capitalist states, the intent to discredit outside capitalist states, above all West Germany, has thus been foregrounded, not the uncovering of Nazi crimes. We will look more closely than has been the case at these trials unfolding in Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union in the hope of uncovering fresh perspectives. As a result of time constraints, we will not have to forego inclusion of additional countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. In the period we are interested in between 1960 or between the late 1950s and 1968, we can observe several shared features. First, following phases of instability and of political opposition, the individual state's domestic political situation became calmer as a result of massive force. A short political thaw set in Germany, the so-called Tauwetter period. Second, in German, the Tauwetter period. Second, the Eichmann trial was not only closely observed in the West, but in Eastern Europe as well. And this led to two developments within the East European countries. On the one hand, to an effort at coming up with a shared stance vis-à-vis Israel. On the other hand, to each individual country addressing the problem of how to deal with the crimes that had been perpetrated by the Nazis there. In our context, a number of interrelated questions emerge here. How was the Holocaust treated in the trials organized in the Eastern European countries in this period? What led to the accusations and what were they specifically? How was the evidence gathered and what were the judgments? How were the trials reported? What narrative emerged both before the court and between the press accounts? And finally, did the Iron Curtain perhaps gain porosity in the context of prosecution for Nazi crimes? At issue here is both the institutional role of officials and that of individual actors, including historians, jurists, and journalists. Compared to other professional groups, was it easier, for example, for journalists to establish contacts beyond the East-West border, acquire material, and furnish impetus for trials? Were they acting on a foundation of domestic political liberalization, or did they still have to contend with widespread anti-Semitism and state apparatus? Such questions, taking different form in the various countries involved, should help us better understand the interconnected dynamic of at work in the way Warsaw-Pact countries approached the trial and sentencing of Nazi criminals. I would like to offer heartfelt thanks to all the people who made our shared conference possible. First of all, to Joachim von Puttkamer and Raphael Utz and all the people of the Kertes-Kolleg in Jena. And a special word of gratitude goes to Katharina Rauschenberger from the Fritz Bauer Institute, who has developed a conceptual framework of the judiciary panels. And I also would like to thank for valuable tips for these panels to Katharina Stengel. Organizing this conference has required a great deal of technical effort. Joachim von Puttkamer already said it. I thank both Hannah Hecker and Werner Lott for an engagement making possible what seems to me a very, very attractive conference website, and for managing what we have planned over the next 2 days on Zoom webinar, on YouTube live stream, and finally in Wonder. Hannah Hecker also offered wonderful guidance to the speakers in the week of conference preparation, and I'd like to thank her warmly also for this. And I also would like to express my thanks to Nathalie Schüler, who will be making sure that everything goes smoothly over the next 2 days when it comes to respect to the conference telephone, and also to Manuela Ritzheim and Marina Gribanova, who are managing the conference administrative side. Joachim von Puttkamer will now introduce Mary Fulbrook, our first keynote speaker. I thank her very, very much for her keynote. Both her lecture and the following presentation by Jan Tomasz Groß were recorded before this conference, and they will now speak, so to speak, be presented live. And as they are keynote lectures, there will be no subsequent discussion afterwards today. So please, Joachim von Puttkamer.
Thank you. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Mary Fulbrook. She's professor of German history at the University College in London. And since we're slightly ahead of time, I could now spend an extra 6 minutes on reading out her list of application, which I will not do. I'll restrict myself only to the most important ones, which address many major aspects of modern and contemporary German history. Starting with Anatomy of a Dictatorship inside the GDR, 1949 to 1989, which came out in 1995. Then The People State, East German Society from Hitler to Honecker, which came out in 2005. Or Dissonant Lives, Generations and Violence Through the German Dictatorships, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2011. For her book, A Small Town Near Auschwitz, Ordinary Nazis and the Holocaust, she won the 2012 Frankel Prize. Among her many professional commitments, I would only mention that she served on the advisory board of the Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora Memorial Foundation. And I would also mention that in 2013, she was guest professor at the Jena Center 20th Century History, where we also first met. Mary Fulbrook was scheduled to return to Jena last year as a guest professor in a larger project on GDR experience and transformation, which had to be postponed for COVID-19 reasons, but only postponed. So we're hoping to see her here in Jena rather sooner than later. Her most recent monograph, Reckonings, Legacies of Nazi Persecution and the Quest for Justice, addresses the core theme of our conference, namely the full scope and dimension of Nazi crimes throughout Europe and the difficulties in bringing them to court in Austria, East and West Germany. I'm delighted and grateful that Mary Fulbrook accepted the invitation to give a keynote lecture to our conference titled The Holocaust as a European Project. So if you were here, I would say, Mary, the floor is yours.
The Holocaust is a European project. We're exploring in this conference, quote, the extent to which the Cold War conditioned, framed and formed the histories of the Shoah constructed between 1945 and 1990. I shall focus here particularly on questions of guilt and complicity, which are so crucial to the ways in which the legacies of the Holocaust were refracted through differing Cold War contexts. The extent of collaboration and complicity continued to trouble people across the following decades. There was, and still is in many quarters, a persisting sense that justice was not done, that those who were truly responsible were not adequately brought to account in court, that those who were persecuted were insufficiently recognised or compensated, which in itself is impossible, for their suffering and losses. Even if physical wounds could heal, the damage was irreparable. Lives had been brutally truncated, families shattered, communities destroyed, people displaced, and moral frameworks severely challenged. And not only in the courts of justice and in public and cultural representations, but also at a personal level, people had to deal with the continuing legacies of this past, with reverberations across generations, whether or not the past was explicitly spoken about. Attributing guilt and complicity in the mass extermination of the European Jews and exploring the inadequacies of systems of justice to deal with mass violence on this scale raises challenging questions. What I'm going to do, this is a vast area, and during this conference we'll explore selected issues and specific areas in far more detail. What I'm going to do is briefly sketch in some of the issues under the following 5 general areas. I'll talk first about guilt, complicity and knowledge across Europe at the time, seeing the persecution of the Jews as a European project at the time it was taking place. I'll then switch to an area which I think doesn't come up very much in itself, the question of deception, survival and evasion, both at the time and throughout the post-war decades, varying with whether we're talking about the persecuted or the perpetrators. I'll thirdly turn to a really interesting twist, namely, while at the time so many people were involved in the deportation and extermination of the Jews that many, I would say millions rather than hundreds of thousands of people were in effect complicit in some way in the machinery of persecution. As precisely the trials took off in the public sphere in the 60s and 70s, the big trials, the concentration camp trials, the major perpetrators were put on trial, just as all of that came to the fore and as the Holocaust itself was being theorised and seen as an issue in the 1960s and 70s, and even gained the term the Holocaust with a capital H by the late 70s, 1980s, just as all this was going on, the fact of widespread, far wider complicity was disappearing from public consciousness, was disappearing from view. It's an ironic twist, an ironic turn of developments. I'll fourthly then turn to, very briefly, an overview of some of the ways in which the Cold War affected historical representations of the Holocaust during this period. And finally, I'll come back to the question of the memorial landscape since 1990, since the end of the Cold War, and the ways in which accounting for a compromised past have shifted in the period since 1990. So first of all, then, the Holocaust as a European project at the time, complicity, guilt and knowledge. The Holocaust was initiated and organised by Nazi Germany without Hitler's driving vision and without German leadership, personnel and organisations. The mass murder of European Jews, Roma, the mentally and physically disabled and other victims would never have taken place in the way that it did. Rightly, much attention has therefore focused on understanding specifically German policy and practices in pursuing the Nazi final solution of their self-imposed Jewish question. And increasingly, historians and members of the public have come to recognise what participants knew already at the time, namely that not only tens of thousands of members of the Einsatzgruppen, the SS and the police battalions were so easily identified as perpetrators, but also many more hundreds of thousands of ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, bureaucrats and civilian administrators were deeply implicated in the persecution and the mass murder of millions of Jews and others across Europe. But it's also clear, and was more than clear at the time, that Nazi Germany found partners, accomplices and auxiliaries across Europe. Without the collaboration, cooperation or acquiescence of millions of Europeans in states allied with, occupied or annexed by the Reich, the deportation and mass murder of the Jews could not have taken place on the scale and in the manner that it did. The responses and actions of other Europeans not only affected the timing and character of persecution, deportations and killings, as we know, but also significantly shaped the relative survival chances of Jews in different regions, ranging from more than 98% in Denmark and 75% in France, through 25% in the Netherlands, to a mere 5% at best in Lithuania, with other countries along the range between. There was a fatal combination between German initiatives and a range of different local interests, from organised nationalist movements such as the Lithuanian Activist Front or the UAN in Ukraine, through simmering forms of popular anti-Semitism that could be readily whipped up under particular conditions, to individual profiteering and benefiting, as well as constrained and unwilling cooperation under conditions of duress, as locals were requisitioned by Germans to carry out different tasks in the wider project of murder. And all of this on the Eastern Front in the summer and into the autumn and winter of 1941-42 was widely witnessed by innumerable onlookers. Germans often filmed shootings where it was Lithuanians, Latvians or Ukrainians wielding the weapons, in part already constructing later German alibis of non-involvement. The notion of never having actually shot anyone physically yourself later served in many quarters as a profession of supposed innocence. Certain incidents stand out in our public imagination today, in part because we have unique eyewitness reports or visual images. A couple of examples that are well known: the killings at the Liepaja beach, for example, photographed and the photos saved remarkably by a survivor who then managed to hide and survive the war, or the brutal killing, the bashing to death of Jews in the garage forecourt, the Lietuvos garage forecourt in Kaunas, which was watched by many onlookers and condoned by the German army.
One German regular army officer wrote, "On the concrete forecourt of the petrol station, a blonde man of medium height, aged about 25, stood leaning on a wooden club, resting. At his feet lay about 15 to 20 dead or dying people. Water flowed continuously from a hose, washing blood away into the drainage gully. Just a few steps behind this man, some 20 men, guarded by armed civilians, stood waiting for their cruel execution in silent submission. In response to a cursory wave, the next man stepped forward silently and was beaten to death with the wooden club in the most bestial manner, each blow accompanied by enthusiastic shouts from the audience."
But it was far wider than just these incidents which stand out in our imagination today. Everywhere, local facilitators and auxiliaries enabled the Nazis to put their murderous project into practice right across Europe. Many others remained passively on the sidelines, some who were unwilling onlookers, who were shocked by the violence that they witnessed, but who nevertheless also frequently benefited from the removal of the Jews, and a few who, in often only tiny ways, managed to put obstacles in the path of deportations and killings, or helped some of the persecuted to survive. The variations in the local dynamics, the significance of different structures of power and repression, of different patterns of social relations between members of different communities, and the significance of different notions of morality and solidarity, or the consequences of individual choices of action and inaction, are all questions that have to be addressed on a European scale. Given the European scale of the Holocaust, millions of people knew about some aspect of what was taking place before their eyes, done both by and to people whom they knew personally, whether or not they were themselves involved. But people generally only perceived or registered fully what was in some way, geographically, socially, emotionally, close to them. There were wide variations in degrees of knowledge, circulation of rumours, and frameworks of interpretation. And there was a deep asymmetry in the extent to which people were desperate for knowledge, or sought to avoid being too aware of what was happening. Those immediately affected by persecution took a desperate interest in news about the fates of friends, relatives, members of their community who had disappeared. But those, on the other hand, who had basically either supported or turned a blind eye to anti-Semitic measures during the pre-war years, generally found it far easier to ignore rumours of atrocities or to remain indifferent to what should have been morally deeply disturbing news, essentially refusing to put together the clues or to form a wider picture of what was happening. Meanwhile, even those at the forefront of violence often also had limited perspectives, arguably preferring to believe the propaganda about partisan warfare than to register the enormity of killing women, children, babies, the sick and the elderly, simply because they were Jewish. For virtually everyone, apart from the masterminds at the centre of the spider's web, secure knowledge of the extermination of Europe's Jews was partial, restricted to specific incidents, and viewed from limited perspectives. Within the Reich itself, Germans had already been practising habits of either looking away, protecting themselves from uncomfortable reactions in having to witness and see what was going on in their name, or looking on. It's remarkable not only how many people did gather to stare, but also how many people criticised having to see acts of violence while not actually criticising the violence itself. Either way, they were effectively condoning the perpetrator's actions by failing to intervene and allowing the violence to continue. It was no longer possible, in a situation of systemic violence persisting over a considerable period of time, to remain merely an innocent bystander. But the reasons for passivity ranged from anti-Semitism, or indifference on the one hand to the fate of the Jews, through the prioritisation of both personal and patriotic interests in wartime, to conflicted feelings of powerlessness and despair at the other. The one thing that very few could claim at this time was ignorance. Even if the overall shape of persecution and ultimately extermination was not discernible to contemporaries, small details and local incidents should have demonstrated all too clearly that acts of total inhumanity were taking place before people's eyes. Lack of knowledge was not the issue. What is contentious are the reasons for inactivity or failure to oppose what was going on. Yet, even so, there was no wider picture of the Holocaust at the end of the war. Survivor accounts in the early post-war years, such as those captured in David Boder's remarkable collection of recorded interviews in DP camps, or the many stories collected by researchers for the Jewish Historical Commission, or other testimonies given shortly after the end of the war, are often fragmentary, piecemeal. And at precisely the same time, Germans who had been on the side of the perpetrators began to claim that they had known nothing about it. Davon haben wir nichts gewusst. A national anthem, as the photographer Margaret Burke-White and journalists who accompanied her In 1945, Germany registered as being very widespread when Germans were forced to confront and register explicitly what had been done in their name. The emergence of a wider understanding of the Holocaust, the shape as a whole, came only over the following decades and was radically reshaped by the restructuring of European politics and societies during the Cold War decades. So let me turn to my second section, deception, survival and evasion. Among those hundreds of thousands who had played a significant role in the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews, evasion of justice and deception about a compromised past were crucial. This had to start already after the end of the war in face of varying attempts at purification, denazification, radical restructuring, but everywhere it was greatly shaped by the implications of the Cold War, directly or indirectly. Internationally, the Allies set the tracks. The American prioritization of Cold War interests in the fight against communism meant, as we know, that many big Nazis were able to lead new lives quite openly in the West. Routes to escape justice, such as the infamous Rat Line through Italy, assisted by the Vatican, allowed some of the more compromised individuals to disappear into relatively obscurity, only rarely discovered and brought to account in the courtroom. And notable examples, of course, include Adolf Eichmann, finally brought to justice in Jerusalem, but there were many, many more who disappeared without a trace. In the Federal Republic of Germany, under its first Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, the continuing fight against communism facilitated the rehabilitation of many former Nazis, even in high places. In the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, and Eastern Europe, those who were considered to be particularly useful to the communist project in some way, whether as scientists and engineers or as secret informers, were similarly, although in different ways, spirited away, for example, to the Soviet Union, rather unwillingly in many cases, or assisted in quiet reintegration, easily blackmailed in order to assist in domestic surveillance and spying on compatriots, as seen in the practices of the East German Stasi. Over time, many people under communism had to adopt new lives, to develop, and particularly during the more stable Cold War era in the 60s and 70s, we often find examples, quite surprising examples, of former perpetrators, Nazis, who are dug up, who are brought to court, and yet it is revealed that they'd led remarkably good lives as good communists, members of different communist organisations, or at least had remained passive citizens fitting in and accommodating themselves to the new conditions after the war, radically changing their behaviours and amending the stories they told or did not tell about their past. Now, the issue of deception is interesting, and I mean it here in a wider sense than the sort of deception I've just been talking about. I'm talking now about a more anodyne way of presenting oneself in everyday life, which, as Irving Goffman pointed out, is an anodyne and, I would imagine, universal practice as people present particular versions of a public face in order to align themselves with norms that they assume to be dominant in the surrounding community. And we tend, in some respects, to have an ambivalent response to this. We sort of don't like the notion of deception unless we sympathise with the wider aims and goals of the person doing the deceiving. And if we think about the war period and the Holocaust, deception among the persecuted is something that we can all, I think, sympathise with very easily. Deception by the persecuted took on far more difficult forms, deliberate deception as persecution worsened, attempting to hide in plain sight by passing as non-Jewish, for example, or when in the camps trying to pretend one was older and healthier than one was, pinching one's cheeks to make them look rosy, lying about one's age to pass the selection for labour rather than the gas chambers. And that all seems to us sort of okay. What I think has been inadequately recognised is the fact that this practice, that was an essential survival technique for so many people, had longer term consequences after the war for many of the persecuted. One survivor, for example, talked of the way in which she could never afterwards really be sure of who she really was, because she had spent her entire childhood and teenage years passing off as someone different from who she really was, because who she really was somebody who should, in principle, in essence, not be worthy of life. And so she was never secure in her own identity, even as an adult many years later. So there are consequences of this for those who had to go through it on the side of the persecuted. But I think the story is quite different on the side of the perpetrators. And here there's also a quite interesting twist about which I think it raises a sense of ambivalence, certainly, when I think about it in more detail. Innumerable people had, in Germany, fallen into line with Nazism, including many former socialists or communists who were terrified about the consequences for their families after Hitler came to power in January 1933. And who then suddenly became members of the NSDAP. And there were innumerable jokes at this time about so-called beefsteak Nazis who had turned brown on the outside but remained red on the inside. Conformists, for whatever reason, there were many other reasons, careerism and opportunism, for example, as well as genuine enthusiasm about the new Nazi movement. But conformists, for whatever reason, effectively furthered the racist project through their outward behaviour, even if they harboured inner doubts and a sense of disquiet. And later, many who had in practice gone along with it would claim with a grain of truth that they'd actually always been against it, immer dagegen, and had retreated into inner emigration. But their outward compliance had led into more active complicity and involvement, ultimately, in the expanding machinery of persecution. So these background patterns of behaviour during the Third Reich were transmogrified under different post-war conditions. Survivors often felt uncomfortable wherever they ended up. In Poland, as we know, returning Jews soon discovered not only that their own families and communities had been destroyed, but also that Jewish returnees were deeply unwelcome, treated to a hostile reception very often by former neighbours who had taken over their homes and possessions, and fearful of extreme violence, many survivors fled again, hoping to emigrate elsewhere. In France, there were other causes of unease. The official French emphasis on resistance and the significance of French citizenship rather than religion or ethnicity as a ground for identity led to a downplaying of the Jewish tragedy, evidenced, for example, in otherwise moving early cultural representations, such as Alain René's 1956 film Night and Fog. Even in relatively tolerant societies with significant Jewish communities, North America, for example, bits of North America, Brooklyn notably, or North London, or parts of Australia, even the Jewish homeland of Palestine, Israel, survivors often had a hard time trying to fit in and felt they had to make strenuous efforts to appear normal, despite the enormity and impact of what they had been through. Wherever they settled, survivors felt they had to present new selves. And again, I think there are a lot of survivor memoirs which record this very vividly, feeling they had to laugh, feeling they had to try and pretend they were enjoying themselves, suppressing feelings of acute despair. Whether to fit in with new communities where there was little understanding or sympathy for their experiences, or whether to protect themselves from their traumatic memories, including of former partners and children they had lost, or to protect their post-war new families from full knowledge of the ghastliness that had overshadowed their own lives. Some members of the second generation, for example, only found out after the death of a parent that there had been a previous marriage and previous siblings, half-brothers, half-sisters perhaps, who had not made it through and whose existence had been entirely silenced. So we can generally feel a great deal of sympathy for the deceptions, large and small, practiced by those who had been persecuted. The same is less likely to be the case with respect to people on the perpetrator side. But here too there were gradations, and some of these are quite interesting in terms of their impact on our understanding of Nazism and the Holocaust. After the defeat of Germany, people reformulated their previous activities in ways that would be more acceptable in the new Cold War circumstances. There were some obvious and easily detectable deceptions, the omission, for example, of potentially incriminating former functions or memberships of certain organisations on denazification papers immediately after the war, or on later immigration and citizenship applications. But there were also more subtle ways in which aspects of a compromised past could be silenced or reshaped. Ways of talking about the Nazi era included strategies for self-distancing to avoid acknowledgement of guilt or complicity. Strategies of particular importance included highlighting ignorance. I've already mentioned the refrain, "We never knew anything about it," with the implication that had one known, one might have acted differently, and it here is progressively reduced effectively to simply the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Highlighting distance, having supposedly been far away from wherever terrible things were happening. And I've seen this even with somebody who was working as a school teacher in the town of Oświęcim, Auschwitz, and who, because she was outside the gates of the concentration camp and of Birkenau, never actually saw what was behind the gates, and somehow even then felt she was distant enough never to have known anything about it, even though she hints at the ashes that floated in the wind when the crematoria were in full swing. Highlighting powerlessness, lack of agency, having no alternatives, no leeway to resist or refuse through alleged fear of the consequences. And it's remarkable how it's on the perpetrator side that lack of agency is so emphasised, whereas on the survivor side, survivor guilt is that desperate feeling that you could have used what limited agency you did have to have done more, to have saved a brother, a small child, a parent, or how you shouldn't have misused your agency to eat somebody else's crust of bread at night in a concentration camp. So the lack of agency is very much among those, or the claim to the lack of agency is very much among those who are on the perpetrator side. And at the extreme, when we're talking about people who are on trial for acts of perpetration, it becomes quite extraordinary. Even though expert testimony produced for the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial demonstrated that supposed fear of penalties for refusing to carry out orders was unfounded, this defence was nevertheless still effective. Having supposedly acted under putative duress was still sufficient in many West German trials to prove that defendants who had driven tens of thousands of people into the gas chambers, for example in the Belzec trial, had not been supposedly acting of their own volition or out of base motives, but had been merely following orders for fear of the consequences of refusing, and were therefore found not guilty of the charge of murder. As we will be hearing, systems of justice differed across different states on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and the statements of defendants and eyewitnesses in court varied accordingly. So too did the patterns of speech in everyday discourses about a compromised past. Source criticism belongs to the everyday toolbox of professional historians and of course taken into account by scholars, but public consciousness of the past was affected by the discourses and politics of the Cold War era. And when we look at the significance of war crimes trials in this wider context, some curious twists emerge. effectively aiding the evasions of those far wider numbers of Europeans who had been among those who were complicit but were not brought to trial. So let me turn to my third point, the disappearance of complicity. One might at first think that the combination of the Allied trials in the later 1940s and the big trials of the 1960s and 70s would raise questions of guilt and complicity in the Holocaust to the centre stage of both scholarly research and public attention. And of course, these trials did massively serve to stimulate investigations into particular crime scenes, producing extensive files of statements by witnesses and defendants, as well as to pique public interest and provoke controversies fought out in the media spotlight. Without the huge body of material collected during legal investigations, our knowledge of the crimes of the Holocaust would be greatly impoverished. Yet, there is a curious irony to be observed here. It could be summarised as follows. As people became more aware of significant crime scenes and major perpetrators through public trials, so at the same time, the complicity of the hundreds of thousands, more likely millions, of accomplices and beneficiaries progressively disappeared from view, and early knowledge was more easily displaced by professions of ignorance. In the first few years after the war, in addition to the Allies' trials, there were numerous smaller trials dealing with local crime scenes and highlighting local involvement in Nazi crimes. The selection and emphases of cases varied in different states, but the fact of widespread complicity was all too evident and unavoidably present in popular consciousness. Once the smaller offences attracting lesser penalties were no longer actionable, however, these trials ceased. The sheer extent to which people had not merely known about, but had actively participated in, the violence that had everywhere engulfed European society under Nazi rule began to disappear from public consciousness. Only the trials of major crimes that were still actionable in a court of law remained in the spotlight. And although definitions varied with jurisdiction, the restrictive definition of murder as an individually motivated act further deflected attention from wider involvement and complicity in systemic violence. The notion of perpetrator was narrowed down to refer primarily to high-level perpetrators, preferably already dead, who had initiated, in the case of the Nazis, and organised the Holocaust, or lower-class thugs, preferably foreign, who had manned the concentration camps or carried out killings on the ground. Not even all of these could be found guilty of murder until the change in legal practice in Germany, with the conviction of former Sobibor guard John Demjanjuk in 2011, a shift that came far too late for the vast majority, even of direct physical perpetrators, to be found guilty in the courts of the Third Reich successor states, and particularly the Federal Republic of Germany. Meanwhile, other groups evaded the spotlight almost entirely, or were targeted precisely for their group identity and not their individual guilt, depending on which side of the Iron Curtain you were on. In West Germany, members of professional groups such as the Nazified judiciary that had condemned people to incarceration or death for trivial political offences, even making political jokes in the last years of the war, or the medical profession involved in the so-called euthanasia programme, or the civil service administering expropriation, exploitation and ghettoisation in the annexed and occupied territories, or major industrialists and employers of slave labour who had managed to make massive profits but refused to pay compensation. They also managed to avoid being brought to account in West German courts for the most part. In East Germany, by contrast, people could initially, in the very early years, be ousted from their positions and stripped of their property simply by virtue of being a large estate owner, a big industrialist, a monopoly capitalist, and so on. And I won't go through the differences in the trials between East and West Germany, but the different definition and the different approach to trials in East Germany meant that former Nazis were 6 or 7 times more likely to be prosecuted, convicted, and given significant sentences in East Germany than in West Germany, despite West Germany's incredible reputation for having faced up to its past. Essentially, the West German story is one of facing up to its past in public controversies, but not in the courtroom. Austria, meanwhile, with its embarrassing acquittals and its dwindling trickle of trials that more or less dried up after regaining full sovereignty in 1955, had by the 1970s acquired the reputation among critics of being one big zoo for the preservation of former Nazis, while hiding behind the convenient epithet of supposedly being Hitler's first victim. So the records of justice in the 3 successor states of Nazi Germany really tell their own story. The picture of the Holocaust, even as it acquired the name and became a focus of growing public attention from the later 1970s onwards, was increasingly focused on the extremes of organised violence in the concentration camps, symbolised particularly by the word Auschwitz. As members of the second generation in West Germany increasingly expressed their sense of shame through remembrance of victims, and an ever broader range of victims were belatedly receiving public recognition, now including finally Roma and Sinti, homosexual men, victims of compulsory sterilisation and euthanasia policies and forced labours, and even as survivors of camps and forced labour, now reaching retirement age, were increasingly giving testimony, both in private for the benefit of their families and also in recorded interviews for archives and documentaries. Even as all this was taking place and the Holocaust was really taking off as a major focus of public and cultural interest, at precisely this time, the roles that ordinary people had played in making mass murder possible were fading from view. The mass shootings right across the Eastern Front were somehow displaced in visibility by the focus on Auschwitz. And yet this was the arena of the Holocaust in which hundreds of thousands of Germans had personally participated. It was much easier to reduce the Holocaust to Auschwitz, and indeed to reduce it even further to just the gas chambers, in order to claim one had known nothing about it. And it was not until after the end of the Cold War, and particularly in the mid-1990s with the travelling exhibition on the crimes of the Wehrmacht, that the participation of ordinary soldiers in mass killings of civilians and the widespread nature of the knowledge about this at home began to reveal to members of younger generations, now the grandchildren as well as the children of perpetrators, the sheer extent of the silencing that had taken place through the preceding decades. In Germany in particular, widespread involvement in perpetration had been hard to acknowledge, while those who had been adults during the Third Reich were not merely still alive, but even still holding positions of power and influence, great and small, whether in local communities or at higher levels. It was hard for the second generation, closely tied by bonds of kinship and love, to have to reconsider their own parents, not merely to critique the parental generation in general, but their own individual mothers and fathers, to readjust the images and stories with which they had grown up within the family, and to decide whether to challenge openly or to refrain from dirtying the nest, as it was seen. But the ways in which members of the second generation addressed the issues raised by parental compromises with Nazism were also affected by the markedly different Cold War contexts and the historical portrayals with which they had grown up. While young West Germans were ashamed to be German, the same was not so true in East Germany, where they had grown up with the myth of anti-fascism and felt no reason for particular shame. Let me turn then fourthly to historical representations during the Cold War period, and this will be an even more sketchy sketch covering a vast amount of ground very briefly. The Cold War massively affected the character of historical representations in both books and memorials in ways that are clearly obvious and in some more subtle ways. The obvious aspects have to do with the selective emphases and omissions for political purposes, as well as the inaccessibility of many research materials, the restrictions on sharing materials, even for war crimes trials, which we'll hear more about, and significant constraints on scholarly exchanges. The less obvious ways have to do with the kinds of historical picture that were constructed through choice of words, concepts, and frameworks of interpretation. And here I shall simply suggest some of the ways in which I think one can look at this in an overall sense. From a Western perspective, committed to essentially Weberian notions of the separation between scientific analysis and value positions, accounts written on the communist side of the Iron Curtain could be readily dismissed as deeply tarnished by political instrumentalisation. The intended propaganda effects were quite obvious in narratives where the heroes were left-wing anti-fascist resistance fighters, led of course by the communists, and the villains were fascist imperialist monopoly capitalists, still supposedly holding the reins of power in the West. So it was an easy game for Western critics in the 1980s to point out supposed blank spots in, for example, GDR history books, where the bothersome Nazi-Soviet pact of 1939 to 41 was simply omitted, while the Soviet liberators were proudly celebrated, not only in books, but also in monumental statues, as in East Berlin's Treptower Park. And while in the GDR, the Jewish victims of the Holocaust were rather more present in scholarly accounts than Westerners often acknowledged, they gained less space and attention than the heroic communist resistance in public memorial sites such as Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald, which in any event were used for political prisoners in the 1930s before their expansion in 1938. In the Soviet Union, the myth of the Great Patriotic War, which wasn't just a myth, there was a lot of truth to this, overrode any real confrontation with widespread complicity in the Nazi project of the extermination of the Jews. The Soviet Union chose to treat all victims of the massacres in the Holocaust by bullets as Soviet citizens, rather than explicitly recognising the specifically Jewish character of more than 1 million victims along the Eastern Front. This radically affected the memorial landscape of former killing sites and labour camps, while allowing the overwhelming majority of mass graves of murdered Jews to linger unmarked, abandoned, increasingly overgrown. But in Poland, where the major mass extermination sites were located, such neglect was less practicable and indeed impossible at internationally well-known sites with extensive visible remnants such as Auschwitz. Memorialisation of politically acceptable heroes in communist Poland, including Polish martyrs and resistance fighters in Auschwitz I or Polish labourers in part of Treblinka, was combined often with recognition of the fate of the Jews, even if less fully than the latter deserved. I recall my first visit to Auschwitz, in fact, in 1988, where Auschwitz I was swamped by tourist coaches, whereas Birkenau was more or less ignored, entirely neglected, overgrown, and there was only one other person visiting it, walking around at the time that we walked around it. At less well-known sites, there were more off the beaten track, and where the victims had been almost entirely Jewish, particularly Sobibor and Belzec, but also to some extent Chełmno, far less effort was put into public memorialisation at that time. It's easy enough then for Western scholars, and I have to count myself as a Western scholar here, to critique the distortions of representation under communist auspices. But even while public controversies and differences of opinion were far more possible under Western democratic conditions, there were also significant distortions in historical representations on the capitalist side of the Iron Curtain. Many sources, particularly relating to Eastern European trials, were, of course, largely unavailable to Western historians. But the question was not only one of sources, it was also a question of approach. Eagerness to denounce dictatorships, including the current communist versions, lent a particular slant to many West German representations of the Third Reich, where a West German author's democratic credentials could be displayed, while continuing in the anti-communist vein that had been so prevalent under Nazism. Moreover, until the 1970s, the Holocaust itself was frequently marginalised in West German accounts, sometimes even explicitly left to quote Jewish historians, as though German history had relatively little to do with the mass extermination of the Jews. To some extent mirroring the emphases in trials, the focus was often on significant individuals, on Nazi organisations, on industrialised mass murder in the extermination camps. Insofar as the Holocaust was dealt with, it was somewhere far away in the east, hidden in forests in Poland, rather than on the question of wider complicity. There were, of course, marked shifts in emphasis from the later 1970s and in the 1980s on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The question of popular complicity had never been entirely absent. It was explicitly explored, for example, in French historiography and films from the 1970s, including Louis Malle's Lacombe Lucien of 1974, while the responses of bystanders were explicitly brought to the fore in Claude Lanzmann's masterful but controversial 1985 film Shoah. Despite the critical reception this received in Poland, even there the debate was opening up, as evidenced in Jan Blonsky's 1987 work The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. But developments were faltering and partial. In the 1980s, even West German historians, left liberal historians of everyday life, tended to focus rather sympathetically on the so-called little people and their small acts of resistance or refusal in daily encounters. And even such a great pioneering historian as Martin Brochard, who led the Bavaria Project that opened up so many new avenues of inquiry into popular opinion, still failed to recognise in his well-known exchange with Saul Friedlander in the late 1980s that his very emphasis on the supposed normality of everyday life in Nazi Germany, when he had in fact himself been a young boy, was yet again excluding German Jews and ignoring how this was precisely the flip side of discrimination. For all the differences between Eastern and Western European portrayals, what is striking is that everywhere the question of complicity among members of the surrounding societies was to a considerable degree marginalised, if it wasn't entirely ignored. Insofar as it was recognised, the easiest way to explain it was by reference to repression and fear, to highlight the role of terror, lack of agency. This would change significantly with the collapse of communist rule and the opening up of new controversies from the 1990s onwards. So, fifthly and finally, the memorial landscape since 1990 accounting for a compromised past. Historical research has been massively facilitated by the collapse of communism and the opening up of archives, research opportunities and scholarly contacts across the previously relatively impervious Iron Curtain. Both new empirical material and productive theoretical debates have opened up entirely new perspectives on the Holocaust. Research into the perpetrators and facilitators of the mass murder of the Jews on the Eastern Front has in particular made incredible progress since the 1990s. Whether the ordinary men in German police battalions, or the brutalised soldiers in the Wehrmacht, or the Lithuanian, Latvian and Ukrainian auxiliaries, or the ordinary Eastern Europeans who were requisitioned to assist the Germans in their murderous task, we know and understand a great deal more. particularly about their actions during the fateful months in the summer of 1941 as mass killings turned into the eventual shape of the final solution of the Jewish question. The complicity of local people has become the subject of major controversies, not least precipitated by Tomasz Gross's work on Jedwabne. Projects have included not only delving into previously inaccessible archives, but also oral history research and collection of testimonies, such as that carried out by Father Patrick Desbois and his team in Yahad in Unum, while there are still eyewitnesses and even former accomplices alive and willing to talk about what they saw and participated in at the time. Yet the opening up for research is still far from complete. Research on perpetrators in wartime Belarus, for example, has been hampered by continuing lack of access to significant archival resources. All this has served greatly to shift the character of historical debates on the Holocaust. We understand far more about the ways in which centre and periphery interacted as central directives took shape locally and as local initiatives were in turn negotiated and authorised from above. We know more about the curious combinations of social psychological pressures, the impact of experiences in brutal warfare, and the ways in which ideological justifications were brought to bear by people who were not motivated to act by anti-Semitic beliefs, but who had been variously constrained to participate in unprecedented violence and who had been changed in the process. Debates on Germany and on Western European states have moved forwards too. Questions around resistance and rescue, or complicity and the passivity of bystanders, have massively opened up, with discussions on France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and elsewhere across Europe. As far as the Nazi dictatorship itself is concerned, older controversies between intentionalists and functionalists about Hitler's role have been superseded. Meanwhile, new perspectives have illuminated questions about the balance between coercion and consent, repression or enthusiasm in the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. But it has at the same time become increasingly clear that the Third Reich can only be adequately understood in a transnational perspective, taking into account the wider European movements of peoples in colonisation and resettlement programmes, as well as forced labour transfers that are also integral to the history of the Holocaust. The historiography of the Holocaust has itself become increasingly internationalised, with debates and exchanges across the academic world. Even though language barriers and area specialisms remain, it is difficult anymore to describe historiographies in the national terms that were possible in the 1960s or 70s. With the expansion of the internet, and even, alas, as a byproduct of the coronavirus pandemic, currently, web-based seminars are allowing ever more international participation in contemporary debates. The project of understanding the persecution and extermination of European Jews has itself become internationalised. The Holocaust has become a European project today in symbolic ways too. The adoption of the 27th of January as International Holocaust Remembrance Day in some ways binds European nations together in a common framework of symbolic commitment to honouring and remembering the victims, and also, supposedly, learning the lessons for the future. With the expansion of EU membership in the early 21st century, commitment to Holocaust remembrance became even more bound up with officially propagated national identities as good Europeans. Yet, as recent controversies have shown, things are never that simple or straightforward. The Holocaust remains deeply entangled with current national political interests and issues. Governments and groups continue to inflect and to distort Holocaust history in service of collective identity projects, picking up on and twisting previous issues in new ways. In double genocide approaches that are current, for example, in the Baltic states particularly, who suffered both from communism and Nazism, The effective equation of Nazism and communism has led to the resurrection of individual murderers of Jews as national heroes in the fight against communism. People who were during the Cold War decried as fascists are now often celebrated as heroes in the fight against communism, despite having actively assisted Nazis in anti-Semitic violence and killings. Under the current right-wing Law and Justice government in Poland, the current official approach to historical research on Polish complicity with Nazism and involvement in Jew hunting threatens not only to distort the historical picture, but also to constrain the conditions for scholarly research in the present and future, as the recent case against Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking demonstrated all too clearly. And this development is to be seen also elsewhere, as in Hungary and in a different variant in Turkey, where President Erdogan still resists acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide carried out by Ottoman troops more than a century ago. Ethno-nationalist movements postulate some persisting essence or national identity with which individuals identify and which it is possible to defile or offend as a collective even decades after the events under scrutiny. Official myths of innocence, heroism and victimhood are at stake, and the nation defined in this way can still supposedly be defamed even long after individual perpetrators are long hence dead. These apparently contradictory developments are not quite as contradictory as they might at first seem. The rise of ethno-nationalism relates closely to changes in the wider international system and fears of the consequences of new transnational currents often bundled together under the supposed ogre of globalization. Quite separately, there are often also strong personal reasons why these questions still matter so much. Across generations, there remain family connections and emotional sensitivities around aspects of Europe's murderous past. Even when Nazi hunters like Efrem Zurov do finally decide, as inevitably we will have to eventually, that there is no one left alive to hunt, there will still remain feelings of anger, pain, injustice, and potentially also continuing legal issues around lost properties or around compensation and restitution claims. The tangles of European transformation affected by the Holocaust have not yet gone away. It is possible that eventually, with the passage of time, and as new challenges urgently demand our attention, the Holocaust may yet be consigned to history in the sense of something that is dull in the history books and not alive and present in our imaginations and emotions. And future generations may perhaps only occasionally pause to wonder why there are so many memorials to the victims of mass murder across the landscape of Europe. But for now, and particularly in relation to questions of guilt and complicity, justice and cultural representations, the Holocaust remains very much alive. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you very much to Mary Fulbrook for her keynote speech. And now Jan Tomasz Groß will give his keynote. I'm sure everybody knows who he is. Jan Tomasz Groß is a sociologist and a historian, professor of history, emeritus at Princeton University, and prior to joining the Princeton faculty in 2003, Jan Tomasz Groß taught at various universities in the United States, including Yale, Columbia, the NYU, Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, among others. In Europe, he taught in Paris, in Krakow, and in Vienna, and he also taught in Israel, in Tel Aviv. Jan Tomasz Gross has received various honors and awards, including the Guggenheim, Rockefeller, and Fulbright fellowships. He's the author of many well-known books. Among them are Polish Society Under German Occupation, published in 1979, and Revolution from Abroad, the Soviet Conquest of Poland's Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia, published in 1988. And of course, his book Neighbors, The Destruction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, published in 2001. And also his book Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, published in 2006. And Golden Harvest, published in 2011. His book Neighbors, which is also translated in several languages, his book Neighbors triggered a debate in Poland, the consequences of which continue to this day, I think. And Joachim von Puttkamer just outlined these discussions at the beginning of our opening session today. And now we will hear the keynote of Jan Tomasz Gross.
Thank you very much for the invitation to appear today. Before you, I regret very much that we cannot meet in person, but times are the way they are. So the only advantage, of course, of meeting online is that without insulting the speaker, you can cut me off whenever you decide that it's not worth listening to. I think it makes sense to introduce a conference entitled Holocaust and the Cold War by focusing on a theme where both Holocaust and the Cold War mattered most. That is, on Jewish life in Eastern Europe after 1945. But before we get there, I'd like to begin my remarks with a very general and sweeping observation, namely that great wars and revolutions are transformative experiences in people's histories. In particular, they offer rich material to spawn in their aftermaths legitimization narratives, providing frameworks for organization of life in common. One needn't even bother to argue the point with respect to the history of the French or the American or the Russian peoples, where great revolutions stand conspicuously as foundational events, whether of the French or American Republic, or now already gone from the roster of existing states of the Soviet Union. In Eastern Europe, both the First and the Second World War provided a bounty of experiences useful for developing foundational stories. The doctrine of nation-states, issuing these lands into political modernity, and President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points provided a scaffolding for successor states' legitimization narratives in East Central Europe after 1918. But it was the locally produced accounts or legends which really mattered, such as the story of Józef Piłsudski and his legion's crucial role in the restoration of Poland's statehood, for example. Interwar politics in Poland was framed to a large extent by Piłsudski, his followers and successors. Or, as in the case of Germany, where republicanism institutionalized under the Weimar Constitution drew only lukewarm support from what were called at the time Vernunftrepublikaner. Peter Gay eloquently wrote about this in his Weimar culture. Hence, the interwar German history was in essence about the collapse of parliamentary politics and, not surprisingly, a constructed history of the Great War provided a convenient delegitimization narrative of the Weimar Republic with the notorious legend of the Dolchstoß, which within a decade and a half brought to power Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. There were, of course, other reasons for a successful ascent to power of the NSDAP, but the stab in the back narrative was the most effective ideological propeller, comfortably blending conspiracy theory frame of mind, blame the other, politics of resentment, and of course, anti-Semitism. A constructed history of the World War II experience shows its foundational significance in framing post-war politics, perhaps most conspicuously in France. General de Gaulle performed nothing short of a miracle by introducing, to put it mildly, a constructed narrative about the war, which effectively obfuscated French collaboration with Nazi Germany under Marshal Pétain. For a long time, following a brief period of post-war trials and kangaroo justice meted out mostly to women for horizontal collaboration, the story of the so-called Vichy France was conveniently placed under the rug and evaporated from public discourse. It will take 3 decades and a couple of brilliant American historians, Robert Paxton and Michael Marus, to decisively break the spell. But it was a sticky affair even then. A revelatory in this respect documentary film by Marcel Ophuls, The Sorrow and the Pity, made in 1969, was barred from the French television until 1981. Further east, a narrative about the war also provided a founding stone for post-war politics. The coming to power of communist parties in the Soviet Union and then in the so-called people's democracies, that is, the East European countries incorporated into the Soviet bloc after 1945, had its ideological underpinning in scientific socialism and was a historical necessity, as we all know from reading Karl Marx's oeuvre. But the really operating legitimizing formula for communist regimes in Eastern Europe was a claim that only dependence on the Soviet Union can guarantee safety from German aggression, representing, as the just concluded war amply demonstrated, a deathly threat to peoples in the region. Thus, it was in the name of safeguarding the national interest that communist parties would stake their claims to rulership, a somewhat tricky endeavor, as everyone knew that they were being installed in power by the Red Army to run client states of the USSR. Be it as it may, in the immediately post-war period, the ideological formula used by the propaganda of the newly established regimes of Eastern Europe proclaimed that they were following a national road to socialism. In the Soviet Union itself, Stalin also engineered a switch to ground the legitimacy of the Soviet regime in the experience of the Second World War, and thereby move it from being exclusively rooted in Marxism and the mythology of the October Revolution. The Great Patriotic War, Wielkaya Отечественная война, as it was called, was a forge where the Soviet nation, with, to be sure, Russians as the elder brothers, was finally melded together. Henceforth, legitimacy of the Soviet power was simultaneously grounded in Marxism and in nationalism. And with this newly added legitimization narrative in the aftermath of the Second World War, Stalin finally established himself as the regime's founding father on a par with Lenin. For all the myth-making potential that it carried, or maybe because of it, the experience of the Second World War and the German occupation in conquered European states was a fraught subject for national historiographies all over the continent. Primarily because the Nazi regime, and especially its actions as the occupying power, have been so horrific. International consensus behind such an assessment is best exemplified by the Nuremberg trial, an unprecedented act of legal retribution in the long history of intra-European wars. A score of leading German Nazi politicians and military men were condemned to death by an international tribunal for, among others, crimes against humanity. Naturally, given such a pronouncement on the quality of Nazi rule, after the war, all would prefer to frame their wartime national experience as the history of resistance. But the facts on the ground were different. Many parts of Europe, in a variety of ways determined largely by differences in the regimes of German occupation, complicity and collaboration with, rather than resistance to, the German policies predominated. Collective attitudes and behavior changed over time in line with evolving opportunistic calculations as Hitler, from seemingly invincible, appeared increasingly more vulnerable. But national historiographies, caught up in the business of beefing up the sense of national pride, took a long time after the war to catch up with what had actually happened. As Mark Mazower put it, I quote, "For much of the war, Europeans fell into line and contributed what the Germans demanded anyway. After 1945, this was conveniently forgotten," unquote. And inside the uncomfortable story of giving aid and comfort to the enemy, all over Europe, scores of trials broaching such accusations against fellow citizens were conducted after the war. There was the most difficult to confront and to narrate subplot, namely collusion in the persecution of European Jews. As Saul Friedlander put it in his magisterial study about the extermination of the Jews, and I quote Friedlander, "Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. Some of the Christian churches declared that converted Jews were part of their flock, up to a point. To the contrary, many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for their wholesale disappearance. Thus, and Friedlander underlines this sentence in his text, Nazi and related anti-Jewish policies could unfold to their most extreme levels without the interference of any major countervailing interests," unquote. A damning assessment by a distinguished historian, but it took a long time for such awareness to emerge in European historiographies. In Eastern Europe, which became part of the Soviet bloc in the years after 1945, the subject of extermination of the Jews during the Second World War was additionally suppressed from public discussion because of the Soviet stance on the issue. Already since 1942-43, while the war was still going on, the Soviet censorship did not allow information on deliberate German targeting of the Jews for extermination. All the Soviet peoples were supposed to be portrayed as victims of the German fascist atrocities in equal measure. If anyone, only the Russians, the elder brother in the Soviet family of nations, had the right to extra heroism and martyrology in the binding narrative about the war. Certainly not the Jews. An eloquent demonstration of post-war communist elision of the Jewish catastrophe from the collective memory of the war was the flagship Museum of Wartime Atrocities at the site of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp in Poland. 1 million Jews were murdered there in gas chambers. And in the official exhibit commemorating international victims of fascism, brought there from all over Europe to be killed, one couldn't find the word Jew for as long as Poland was ruled by the Communist Party. It took time also in the West before extermination of the Jews emerged as a legitimate subject of scholarly research. When Raoul Hilberg decided to write a doctoral dissertation at Columbia University in New York, it would become the founding classic in Holocaust studies, the destruction of the European Jews, his academic advisor, Franz Neumann, like Hilberg, an exiled Austrian Jew and an early student of Nazi totalitarianism, warned him that with such a topic for a PhD thesis, he stood little chance of getting a university appointment. Against considerable skepticism of fellow academics, Hannah Arendt, in a rare lapse of judgment, turned down the manuscript for Princeton University Press. Hilberg's book finally came out in 1961 at a small publisher, Quadrangle Books, thanks to a subsidy of a private benefactor. Jewish survivors of the war, to a degree far exceeding the circumstances affecting the non-Jews, were destitute, emaciated, ruined, sick, and traumatized. If there ever was a group of people suffering from the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, before the diagnosis was invented, Jewish survivors in post-war Eastern Europe were that group. And not least importantly, the displacement and uprooting of East European Jews did not end when the war has ended. Much, perhaps most of the Jewish population was in motion, in transition during the immediate post-war years. To be sure, this was a general condition at the time. The continent, as we know, was in the mid and late 1940s in a state of flux. Eugene Kulischer called his demographic study of Europe in the 1940s Europe on the move. Just think about the number of people who got registered for repatriation to the Soviet Union immediately after the war. 6.8 million, out of which 5.4 million actually made the journey. In addition to repatriation, the population of Eastern Europe was also affected by expulsions. 13 million Germans thrown out from Poland and the Czech lands mostly, or hundreds of thousands of Hungarians expelled from Slovakia and Yugoslavia. Jewish demographic displacement at the time also had its own peculiarities. For one, I know this about Polish Jews, but I would think that Romanian and Hungarian Jews were similarly affected. Those Jews who had lived in small and mid-sized towns and shtetls. In Poland, this was a good 80% of the pre-war Jewish population, could not return to their pre-war places of residence because they were unwelcome by their former neighbors, and in small communities, their lives were in jeopardy. One cannot easily wrap one's mind around this. I, for one, couldn't for a pretty long time. And I should add that a trove of brilliant Polish intellectuals writing contemporaneously in 1945 and 1946 were utterly perplexed also. But in the immediate post-war period, that is, right after the Holocaust of European Jews had taken place, anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe did not abate, but has, if anything, intensified. My answer to this mystery would be, and I wrote a book on the subject, Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, that this came about because many local people throughout the region were complicit in the persecution and murder of Jews during the German occupation and benefited by taking over Jewish property. And they were determined to defend their spoils while making sure that their wartime misdeeds are not prosecuted by the authorities. In Poland, in the immediate post-war period, anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 Holocaust survivors were murdered. As a result, Jews in post-1945 Poland took residence in a few largest towns, Warsaw, Krakow, Łódź, and in the western areas newly incorporated into Poland, such as the town of Wrocław, Breslau, and in Lower Silesia. This incipient, widespread hostility against the Jews combined with several pogroms and resulted in massive flight to safety of the Jewish population from their countries of origin situated in Eastern Europe. Absolute numbers may not be great by the standards of the epoch. Some 60,000 from Hungary, 120,000 from Romania, and 150,000 from Poland. But given that so many Jews had been killed during the war, this represented anywhere from 1/4 to over half of the entire Jewish population in their respective countries. And remember, there was no Israel to go to at the time. There was a clandestine movement of Jewish refugees to Palestine, organized by young Zionists, the so-called Bricha, but it was hard. And being accepted on a refugee quota to the United States was not easy either. So, of all the places, the primary destination of these voluntary Jewish refugees were DP camps in the American zone of occupation in Germany. Safe among the Germans, Ruth Gay entitled her moving book on the subject. Jewish life in Eastern Europe in the immediate post-1945 years is, to a surprising degree, Jewish life in Germany. Martina Grossman has been writing on this topic through the lens of gender issues, but this is still a widely open subject. At the time, two old anti-Semitic canards, deeply entrenched in the minds of the local population, were the bane of Jewish existence in Eastern Europe. The ritual murder canard and the myth of Judeo-communism. Taking account of wartime spoliation of the Jews, the ritual murder confabulation appeared in a modernized version. In the collective mortalités of East European populations after 1945, Jews were allegedly using blood of Christian children as a diet supplement, rather than merely as an ingredient for the production of matzo. Rumors circulated of Jews giving themselves blood transfusions from captured and murdered Christian children. The ritual murder canard thus acquired a new power and flexibility, as it could be deployed at any time, not merely around Passover. And it served as a trigger to mobilize Christian crowds for anti-Jewish violence on multiple occasions. The most deadly such episodes was the Kielce pogrom of July 4th, 1946. Alongside the ritual murder nonsense, the other old anti-Semitic canard which had currency at the time was the myth of Judeo-communism. I think that deconstructing this tale is not intellectually challenging, as it does not yield interesting insights either about communism or about Jewish life. For the most part, it just reveals the state of mind of anti-Semites. I will stipulate, therefore, for the purposes of this conference, that Jews have not introduced communism into Eastern Europe, just as they had not been responsible for the Bolsheviks' Machtergreifung in Russia in 1917. But since a significant share of Communist Party's membership were people who came from a Jewish milieu, and since internal politics of the communist movement was riveted with internal tensions, communist politics in the region pivoted at times around the so-called Jewish problem. And when one talks about Jewish life in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, at the time when communist parties had the monopoly of power in the region, one cannot shy entirely from Jews and communism issues, as it were. And so, after we spoke briefly about circumstances Jews encountered in East European societies after 1945, let us now shift attention to state policies and power holders insofar as their practices had an impact on Jewish experience. Let us recognize at the outset that anti-Semitism does not belong to Marxism and was not a part of communist ideology. In an ideal world, with communists safely in power, there wouldn't be any anti-Semitism. But in the ideal world envisaged by communism, there shouldn't be any Jews either. Ethnic identification was an epiphenomenon, to use Marx's vocabulary, a thing of the past that was bound to go away. If it found a political articulation and congealed into an organized movement, then it would be promptly denounced as nationalism and destroyed. The anti-Zionist campaign that Stalin launched in his last years is a case in point. But communists, this was deeply ingrained already in Lenin's contribution to the Bolshevik tradition, were also paramount pragmatists of power. And since the wartime experiences of the USSR, they understood that patriotic, indeed nationalist, popular sentiments must be tapped to safeguard the rule of the Communist Party. And if such sentiments among the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Hungarians, the Romanians, or the Poles came with a mixture of xenophobia or anti-Semitism, so be it. There seems little doubt that Stalin catered to and instrumentalized anti-Semitism during the last years of his life. In the words of the former head of NKVD's Department to Investigate Cases of Special Importance, a certain M.D. Ryumin, and I quote now from him, "From late 1947, the tendency to consider persons of Jewish nationality as enemies of the Soviet state became clearly noticeable in the works of the Department to Investigate Cases of Special Importance." He knows what he's talking about, obviously, because he was the head of this department and therefore the one who was doing this. This directive led to the unreasonable arrest of persons of Jewish nationality accused of anti-Soviet nationalist activity and of American espionage, unquote. The situation got progressively worse until, and I continue to quote Ryumin, on December 1st, 1952, at the dramatic meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee, Stalin declared that every Jew is a potential spy for the United States, unquote. And as Jonathan Brent and Vladimir Naumov, authors of Stalin's Last Crime, The Plot Against the Jewish Doctors, explain, referencing the above quote, and I quote now from Jonathan Brent and Vladimir Naumov, Stalin had spoken in this fashion since 1947. Ryumin admitted that everyone was guided by this dictum of Stalin. Stalin was said to have repeated this to several people, who then repeated it until it became common knowledge of an opinion attributed to Stalin. Unquote. In Eastern Europe, the underlying anti-Semitic impetus of Anna Pauker's imprisonment in Romania and of the Slański's trial in Czechoslovakia were also unmistakable. These episodes took place in late 1940s and early 1950s, but even as far back as the earliest phase of the communist reach for power in Eastern Europe, the party had made a clear choice between Jews on the one hand and their local enemies with solid nationalist credentials on the other. Immediately after the war ended, communist parties all over Eastern Europe began to court former members of pre-war fascist movements. I'm quoting now. I, the undersigned, herewith declare that I was a member of the Arrow Cross Party from ... to ... I now realize that my activities were directed against the interests of the people and that my conduct was faulty. I am resolved to atone for what I have done. I promise to support the fight for a people's democracy with everything in my power and to devote my entire energy to the achievement of this task. I herewith solemnly pledge myself to be a faithful fighting member of such and such branch of the Hungarian Communist Party. Unquote. To an American journalist who traveled all over liberated Europe in 1945, the Hungarian Communist Party leader Matthias Rákosi explained the matter thus, and I quote now, "Look, these little fascists aren't bad fellows, really. They were forced into fascism, see. They were never active in it. All they have to do is sign a pledge, and we take them in." Unquote. In Romania, Anna Pauker, the proverbial symbolic Jewish communist of Eastern Europe, struck a deal with the legionnaires, as former members of the fascist Iron Guard were called, immediately after her return to Bucharest. Influenced, as she put it, and I quote her, by the fact that there were more of them, and especially among workers, than I had imagined, unquote. And the rank-and-file Iron Guardists were admitted en masse into the ranks of the Communist Party. At the same time in Poland, the leader of the pre-war fascist ONR Falanga, one Bolesław Piasecki, was released from jail on the orders of the top NKVD operative in the region, Ivan Sierov, and allowed to set up an organization of progressive Catholics, PAX, to neutralize the influence of the Catholic Church. 2 days after he was freed from jail, Piasecki was received by none other than the current, at the time, first secretary of the Polish Communist Party, Władysław Gomułka. Serge Moscovici, one of a cohort of brilliant Romanian self-exiled intellectuals who settled in Paris after the war, noted the complementary predicaments of radical right and radical left in East European politics. The rightists had ample social backing from before the war, but were out of power now and were anxious to get into the game. The leftists, on the other hand, had power in the immediate post-war years, but no social base to speak of, and had to mobilize one in order to acquire legitimacy. Hence, the carefully orchestrated fusion between communists and fascists in post-war Eastern Europe, in a literal exemplification of the principle that les extrêmes se touchent. Allow me to add a small illustration from my book Neighbors in the above sketched context. One of the most brutal killers in Jedwabne on July 10, 1941, later convicted in the Jedwabne murder trial, who was a rabid nationalist before the war, and who managed to join the Communist Party immediately after the war, wrote in his clemency plea from jail without being completely ridiculous, given the recruitment policies of Communist parties in the region at the time. And I quote him, "I believe that on shoulders like mine, our workers' regime may safely rest." Unquote. The central authorities in Warsaw or Prague or Bucharest or Budapest, as the case may have been, were not happy about this state of affairs. In other words, about the infusion of pre-war fascists into the ranks of the party and lower ranks of the state administration. The Ministry of Public Administration in Poland, for instance, kept sending memos to its subordinates, who acted on anti-Semitic impulses, giving short shrift to Jewish petitioners showing up with assorted requests that the state administration had to handle, imploring subordinates in state administration to give Jews equal treatment. And after all, the Ministry of Justice in Warsaw set the Jedwabne murder investigation in motion, for example. But communists in Eastern Europe had their hands full. They had to pick their fights. Making sure that Jews were treated fairly was not a priority. Karl Lerman published a long piece on Hungary in the January 1946 issue of Commentary, an important magazine founded in 1945 by the American Jewish Committee, where he reported that, and I quote now, "Neo-anti-Semitism is not the Jews' chief complaint here. Its existence is obscene, to be sure, after the price paid in lives, but it would have been expected. What is startling, and in the opinion of Hungarian Jews, the most shocking element in their present position, is the cool indifference to the resurgence of anti-Semitism of the new anti-fascist regime." Unquote. In a few paragraphs tinged with sadness, Moscovici, whom I quoted earlier, similarly assessed the circumstances of post-war Romania. Quote, "This renaissance of anti-Semitism in national life, which was neither dead nor dormant, was embarrassing. Not much could be done about it, however, since it was so useful to everybody. Of all popular passions, this was the only one that remained intact. Liberal parties discreetly let it spread around. The Communist Party declined to fight against it in order not to irritate the people." Unquote. Communists in Poland were confronted with overwhelming popular sentiment on the Jewish issue, and they could ignore it or fight it only at their own peril. On August 19, 1945, in the cinema called Heaven, Raj, in Bochnia, for example, a full house of delegates assembled for a county meeting of the Peasant Party. The gathering, by invitation only, brought together local activists, the elite of Stanisław Mikołajczyk's political opposition. Mikołajczyk had given up the prime ministership of the government in exile in London and returned to Poland to join the government of national unity at, among others, Churchill instigation in June of 1945. An anonymous rapporteur submitted an account of the meeting to the Krakow's voivodeship office, writing as follows, and I quote from the report now. "In turn, the third speaker took the rostrum, his name unknown, and by analogy to a thesis from the minister, of public administration speech, who addressed the room just before, that Poland must be a mono-ethnic state. This was apropos of expulsion of the German population from newly incorporated territories, put out a resolution that Jews should also be expelled from Poland. And he also remarked that Hitler ought to be thanked for destroying the Jews. Tumultuous ovation and applause, writes the rapporteur. Unquote. But then one must simultaneously remember that in post-war Eastern Europe, Jews had unprecedented opportunities for professional advancement and upward social mobility. There were no glass ceilings barring Jews from pursuing careers, not only in the so-called free professions, such as law or medicine, but also in state institutions at a time of expanding etatization of the economy and politics under the sway of ruling communist parties. Jews could become teachers, policemen, professors, army officers, state bureaucrats, managers of state enterprises, what have you. Unheard of in these societies before the war. And of course, Jews were admitted into East European communist parties, though they might be advised to change their Jewish-sounding names into more indigenous-sounding ones. And some of them were dedicated and very talented and lucky and shrewd and cunning, endowed, in a word, with all the skills that make a successful politician. And a number of such individuals rose high in the party ranks. But no matter how far they ascended, they could always be reminded by friend and foe alike, and they could never forget, no matter how emotionally and intellectually distant they may have been from their family background, that they were Jewish. Their ethnic background was a colossal liability and an impediment to their careers from every point of view. And it even led some of them, including the most successful ones, to the gallows. 10 out of 14 defendants in the Slański trial in 1952 in Prague were of Jewish origin, and the prosecution framed the accusation by portraying defendants as Zionist agents. The next spectacle of official Communist Party-sponsored anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, again dressed in the garb of anti-Zionist campaign, will be witnessed in Poland during the so-called March events of 1968. Holocaust, where the Cold War mattered most and where most of the Holocaust was carried out, there is in Eastern Europe, was a non-issue after 1945. There was a sort of tacit consensus between the communist rulers and the local society, two entities which were otherwise at odds with one another pretty much about everything, not to broach the subject. Communist parties, striving to appear as bearers of national interests and running away from the Judeo-communism stereotype popular among the locals, had no taste to be caught as advocates of Jewish suffering. The local people, inasmuch as many individuals and organizations had acted as facilitators and were beneficiaries, to use Mary Fulbrook's apt terminology, of the Holocaust rather than its bystanders, also were not anxious to have this aspect of the recent past closely examined. And this worked pretty well, and for a pretty long time. As even an intellectually hungry and politically insubordinate youth, daring the regime with the arrogance of teenage invulnerability, anxious to dig up embarrassing secrets of recent history, and curious to poke around and really expose mistakes and distortions, an oblique formula behind which communist parties, when they finally got to admit it, tried to cover up crimes of their Stalinist past. In other words, a generation that really confronted their elders, the 68ers, we didn't peep a word about the Holocaust. I am not speaking about Germany, of course, I'm speaking about Eastern Europe. It seemed to us as if nothing had been swept under the rug as far as the Holocaust was concerned. The Germans have killed the Jews. Period. A tragic story, but there was nothing more to say, or if you will, to learn about it. What makes this absence of curiosity even more bizarre is that so many of us, the most active 68ers in Poland, were Jewish. Today we know that the most significant suppressed story which came to the surface after 1989 and caused a still continuing huge public debate was not about some Cold War transgression of the Communist Party deeply hidden in its secret archives. Instead, it was the obfuscated, obscure, and removed from public view by tacit agreement between the communist rulers and their recalcitrant subjects everywhere in Eastern Europe story of local people's complicity during the Holocaust in the persecution of their Jewish fellow citizens. In closing, I would like to share with you an observation which struck me recently when I realized that for most Poles, and the same I'm pretty sure applies to the Hungarians, Romanians, Ukrainians, or the Lithuanians, including superbly educated members of the so-called liberal intelligentsia, for most Poles, the Holocaust is an episode which had affected somebody else. What I want to say is that the perception of the general public, or if one were to use a long-established sociological concept, in the collective memory of the people, Holocaust is not conceived as a component part of mainstream Polish history. It is instead understood as something that has happened to them and not to us. But if 1/3 of the urban population of a country is suddenly removed, excised from the social fabric, as it were, I'm talking about 3 million Polish Jews, 1/3 of Poland's urban population killed during the Holocaust, then the rest of so affected society is set in motion. Any social scientist will tell you this without hesitation, in a massive process of social transformation and social mobility. From the perspective of a social historian, it seems to me, an externalization of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, espousing conviction that it has happened to them and not to us, requires as an underpinning a very peculiar mental framing of historical phenomena. It would be as if the French people espoused the belief, because victims of the Great Terror came predominantly from the aristocracy, that the French Revolution was an episode in just the history of the French nobility. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Jan Tomasz Gross for his keynote speech. And also many thanks to Mary Fulbrook for her speech. We now don't have a discussion, but we will have discussions tomorrow. And before we finish our opening session of our conference, let me give you some small technical informations for the next 2 days. All those who will follow the conference via YouTube live stream, you all will have the possibility to ask questions. You can do this via the YouTube chat. You simply enter your questions in the chat and they will be forwarded to the chairs of the panels and they will discuss your questions with the speakers. In order to ask questions via YouTube, you will need a Google account. But there is also an alternative. If you don't want to create a Google account, you just send us your questions via email and we will forward them to the chairs. You will find the address on our conference website, the address where to send your questions. On the conference website, you find all the informations. You also find the instructions for the live stream and the stream button and a description how to operate. And I also would like to inform you that it is still possible to sign up for the film tomorrow evening, the film Cold Days by Andras Kovac, beginning at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Before Hannah Hecker now will report back with some hints for the speakers of the conference, I want to say goodbye to all our external participants. We will meet again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Joachim von Puttkamer and I, as well as the teams of the Fritz Bauer Institute and the Imre Kertész Kolleg Jena, we all are very much looking forward to the next 2 days. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.